In one of the coldest and most isolated regions of Russia, there is an energy infrastructure called Yamal Cross, a gas pipeline crossing that Moscow might prefer to keep invisible in times of war. But seen from space, it appears like an open scar on the tundra, lines of energy, money, and power converging at a single point. For decades, this infrastructure helped sustain Russian energy influence over Europe. But after the war against Ukraine, the sanctions, and the end of the old gas routes, this place stopped being merely a symbol of export. It became something much more dangerous, a possible weak point inside the Kremlin's own war economy. And now, the distance that protected this target from the armed conflict may no longer be enough. Ukraine has already shown that it can strike military factories deep inside Russia with its own long-range missiles. If this capability becomes consolidated, Moscow will have to deal with a new threat, not only losing equipment on the front, but seeing its strategic energy infrastructure enter the risk map of Ukrainian military power. But what makes this crossing so important? How did it go from symbol of Russian power to possible financial vulnerability? And why could a Ukrainian missile called Flamingo completely change the Kremlin's security calculation regarding this infrastructure? Before understanding the size of this threat, we need to go back to the history of Yamal Cross. The Yamal Cross is located in the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous District, a cold, remote, and strategic region in northern Russia. It is an area marked by gas fields, energy infrastructure, and frozen soils, where geography favors both production and vulnerability, vastness, isolation, and the difficulty of permanent defense. The location is near the village of Pangodi on the banks of the Pravaya Hetta River. In satellite images, the outlines of the gas pipelines appear to form crossings drawn directly across the tundra. That is why the site earned the nickname Yamal Cross. This visibility has a technical explanation. Gas pipelines require open security corridors with no trees or shrubs above the passage of the lines. Because of this, in a tundra region, the infrastructure appears clearly in aerial and satellite images. What for engineers is an operational requirement, for military analysts becomes a visual signature that is difficult to hide. Historically, Yamal's importance is tied to the Yamal-Europe system. The gas pipeline was inaugurated on November 6, 1999, and presented as a gigantic work of energy integration between Russia and Europe. The project is described as a construction of the century, precisely because of its scale and strategic meaning. The Yamal-Europe gas pipeline is more than 2,000 kilometers long and connects fields in western Siberia to European consumers passing through Russia, Belarus, Poland, and Germany. Its designed capacity was 32.9 billion cubic meters per year, and in 2013, it reached a record of 34.7 billion cubic meters. This route also had a geopolitical function, allowing Russia to sell gas to Europe without depending entirely on Ukrainian territory. For years, this reduced Kyiv's importance as a transit country and increased Moscow's ability to use energy as an instrument of continental influence. But that world changed after 2022. The Yamal-Europe route lost much of its commercial relevance because of the war, payment disputes, sanctions, and political blockages. The transit of Russian gas through Ukraine ended on January 1, 2025, further reducing the role of the old land routes to the European market. But the loss of the European route does not make the Yamal Cross irrelevant. On the contrary, it changes the type of importance of the target. Before, it was a symbol of export. Now, it is a symbol of internal architecture, network density, and financial vulnerability. A Ukrainian attack on this energy infrastructure would not simply be about interrupting gas to foreign customers. It would be about trying to impose costs, uncertainty, and disorganization in the energy system that sustains part of the Russian economy in times of war. And this is where the long-range Flamingo missile enters the narrative. Ukraine no longer needs to treat all deep targets as dependent on Western authorization. According to Reuters, the FP-5 Flamingo is a ground-launched cruise missile produced by the Ukrainian company Firepoint, with a reported range of 3,000 kilometers. According to Le Monde, it emerged precisely as a national response to the absence of American cruise missiles like the Tomahawk. The strategic consequence is enormous. If the reported range is operationally reliable, the Yamal Cross stops being merely a target too distant for Ukraine. It enters the category of points that Moscow needs to consider vulnerable, not necessarily because they will be destroyed tomorrow, but because the threat begins to exist within Ukraine's own industry. But what would happen if Kyiv managed to turn this strategic Russian energy source into a real point of attack? Would that mean a hard financial, logistical, and military blow against the Russians? Would it accelerate economic collapse and substantially increase the cost of the war for the Kremlin?
Before, the most obvious obstacle was distance. Yamal Cross is located approximately 2,700 to 3,000 kilometers from Ukraine. That number placed the target in the category of extreme range operations, too far away from most of the Ukrainian systems known at the beginning of the war. For that reason, for months, the discussion revolved around American Tomahawk missiles. Ukraine formally requested in October 2025 from the United States these long-range cruise missiles capable of striking targets up to about 2,500 kilometers away. In theory, they could turn deep points of Russian infrastructure, such as the Yamal Cross, into possible targets. The expert Oleg Zhadan, a reserve colonel of the armed forces of Ukraine, even stated that 20 to 50 Tomahawks could be enough to strike this energy junction, although he himself doubted that Washington would authorize this type of transfer. The Ukrainian request even went through an important technical stage. According to reports from the cable news network, based on American and European officials, the Pentagon had assessed that sending Tomahawks to Ukraine would not compromise United States stockpiles, leaving the final decision in Donald Trump's hands. The Guardian reported that the call with Putin weakened Ukrainian hopes of receiving the Tomahawks. Reuters, days later, recorded that Trump stated he was not considering at that moment providing those missiles to Ukraine. It is in this vacuum that the Flamingo changes the equation. Ukraine stopped depending only on American authorization to imagine deep strikes against Russia. Reuters describes the FP-5 Flamingo as a Ukrainian cruise missile produced by Firepoint with a range of up to 3,000 kilometers, almost twice that of the Tomahawk block. Capable of carrying a warhead of about 1,150 kilograms, more than double the typical Tomahawk warhead. The Guardian also reported the use of the Flamingo in Ukrainian attacks and described it as a partial alternative to the Tomahawks that the United States did not provide. In fact, the Flamingo is not a Ukrainian Tomahawk in the full technical sense. The Tomahawk is a mature system, tested for decades, with widely known integration, history, and precision. The Flamingo, on the other hand, is still a new system with less transparent real-world performance. However, it has already been showing effectiveness against long-range Russian targets, as shown by the damage it caused in Votkinsk and Cheboksary. The most important case for understanding this innovation in Ukraine's military technological structure is Votkinsk. In February 2026, Ukraine struck the machine-building plant in the Russian city of Votkinsk, more than 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine. According to Associated Press News, the attack was carried out with FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles and not with drones.
The facility is described as a state-owned factory linked to the production of Iskander missiles and also of intercontinental systems with nuclear capability. Reuters also reported the attack, citing the Ukrainian General Staff, and highlighted that the target was a Russian producer of ballistic missiles. Russia confirmed damage and injuries, although it attributed the attack to drones. For Moscow, admitting that a long-range Ukrainian missile struck such a distant strategic factory would mean recognizing a new and politically sensitive vulnerability.
The second case is Cheboksary. In May 2026, Reuters reported that Ukraine had intensified attacks against Russian targets and cited the use of Flamingo missiles against defense facilities in Cheboksary, about 1,500 kilometers from Ukraine. The city is far beyond the front line and reinforces the idea that Kyiv began operating at a depth that once seemed reserved for long-range Western weapons. Later reports identified the target as the VNIR Progress Complex, linked to navigation and guidance components used in Russian military systems. Business Insider reported that Zelensky stated that the attack struck facilities that supplied navigation and guidance systems used in Russian military equipment, and that the Institute for the Study of War identified 6 missile impacts against the plant. Votkinsk and Cheboksary matter because they are not just any targets. They are pieces of the Russian military-industrial complex. When Ukraine strikes facilities of this type more than 1,500 kilometers, it demonstrates 3 things at the same time: range, intention, and the ability to choose high-value targets. It is not just striking far. It is striking far inside the chain that sustains Russian weapons production. For the Yamal Cross, the message is direct. If the Flamingo was the weapon used against these strategic factories in Votkinsk and Cheboksary, then distance stopped being an absolute protection. Yamal is even farther away, but not outside the range of the Ukrainian FP-5 Flamingo. The next logical leap is not only military, it is financial. If Kyiv can strike missile and component factories at 1,400 or 1,500 kilometers, the question becomes which other strategic nodes may enter the Russian risk map.
The Yamal region annually generates about $25 billion for the Russian state in gas tax revenues. Yamal Cross is located there, consisting of a junction of 17 high-pressure gas pipelines converging at the same point. It is estimated that if at least 8 of these pipelines failed, Russia could have to spend about $200 million only on repairs, in addition to $6.25 billion in lost profit in 1 month of shutdown for the Russian companies Gazprom and Novatek. These numbers point to the real target, not only the gas, but the money that finances the Russian war effort. The Russian war depends on revenue, budget, logistics, indirect imports, military payments, equipment replacement, and internal subsidies. A Ukrainian attack on the Yamal Cross would not need to shut down Russia completely to be relevant. It would be enough to create a chain financial crisis, emergency repairs, a drop in flow, flaring of surplus gas, the need for alternative routes, reinforcement of air defense, fear among commercial partners, and loss of confidence in Russian energy stability. This is the point at which the Flamingo becomes more dangerous for Moscow. A domestic, long-range weapon, already reported in attacks against Votkinsk and Cheboksary, changes the risk calculation. The Kremlin can no longer look at territorial depth as an absolute guarantee. If a missile factory in Udmurtia and a component facility in Cheboksary were placed under threat, then an energy junction in northern Russia also needs to be treated as vulnerable. The financial impact would also be reputational. Russia built for decades the image of an energy power capable of delivering gas on a continental scale. Even with the European route weakened since 2022, and with the end of gas transit through Ukraine on January 1, 2025, Yamal's infrastructure still carries symbolic value. It represents the promise that Russia remains a robust, deep energy supplier protected by geography. An attack on the Yamal Cross would break precisely that promise, not only for Europe, where the resumption of major continental exports is already politically difficult, but also for partners that see Russia as a long-term supplier. A strike against Yamal would threaten Russian hopes of resuming continental gas trade, and it could also affect the Chinese perception of Russia's stability as an energy partner during a prolonged war.
Russian natural gas is not just export. It sustains electricity, urban heating, industry, and part of logistics. A severe interruption would force the Kremlin to prioritize critical facilities, administrative centers, defense, military industry, and major cities. In a country at war, that triage would already be a sign of crisis. Russia's dependence on gas is deep. In 2016, gas reportedly represented 72.6% of the Russian electric industry matrix. Damage to Yamal Cross would result in the risk of electricity outages, reduced heating, and impact on railways. In particular, the European part of Russia concentrates population, elites, industry, and a relevant part of the state machine. It is true that the Russian network has redundancies. Main gas pipelines can have parallel lines, blocking valves, isolatable sections, and repair capacity. But this caveat does not eliminate the strategic impact. It only changes the form of the crisis. Instead of immediate collapse, the result may be restriction, cost, improvisation, and continuous pressure from new attacks on a system that already operates under precarious conditions. And that is why the Yamal Cross should not be seen as an isolated attack. It would make sense within a larger campaign of attrition, the same logic that already appears in attacks against refineries, depots, petrochemical plants, railways, and defense facilities. Ukraine does not need to destroy everything at once. It needs to force Russia to defend everything all the time. If Ukraine can already strike military factories in the heart of Russia, what prevents Kyiv from making it impossible for $25 billion in taxes from the Yamal region to stop entering Moscow's cash reserves and deepen the Russian financial crisis even further?
At first, the question was whether the Yamal Cross could really be hit. Now, after the attacks attributed to the FP-5 Flamingo against Votkinsk and Cheboksary, the question has changed. The problem for Moscow is no longer just imagining an extreme scenario with American tomahawks. The problem is that Ukraine has begun to demonstrate with its own weapons the capability to strike deep industrial targets inside Russia. Votkinsk was the most symbolic warning. Ukraine used FP-5 Flamingo missiles to strike the machine-building plant in the Russian city of Votkinsk, more than 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine. The facility is linked to the production of Iskander missiles and intercontinental systems with nuclear capability. When a factory of this kind is placed under threat, distance stops being a psychological shield for Russia. Cheboksary reinforced the message. Flamingo missiles struck a military-industrial facility in the city associated with the production of navigation and guidance components used in Russian systems. In other words, Ukraine is not just attacking far away, it is choosing targets that pressure the production chain of Russia's war. It is in this context that the Yamal Cross becomes more dangerous for Moscow. It does not need to be treated as a magic button capable of shutting down Russia in a single blow. The threat is more sophisticated,
turning a deep energy node into a source of financial chaos, repair costs, loss of confidence, logistical pressure, and uncertainty over future revenues. The Tomahawks did not come. Ukraine requested these missiles from the United States. The Pentagon technically assessed that a possible transfer would not harm American stockpiles, but the political decision remained with Trump. After speaking with Putin, he lowered expectations and stated that the United States might need to keep the Tomahawks for its own defense. But the threat did not disappear. It changed origin. It is estimated that Ukraine produces about 2 to 3 Flamingo missiles per day and currently has a stockpile of 300 units, with the expectation of reaching 650 units by the end of 2026. It is not a perfect Tomahawk. It is newer and less tested. Even so, it fulfills a decisive strategic function. It shows that Ukraine is creating its own deep reach from a highly lethal domestic arsenal. That is why the Yamal Cross may be more powerful as a credible threat than as a promise of instant collapse. If Moscow needs to defend factories, refineries, railways, depots, drone centers, and now also energy junctions in the Russian Arctic, the cost of the war spreads across the entire territory. The true risk for Russia is not only losing pipelines at Yamal Cross, it is seeing its war economy enter a cycle of spending, fear, and permanent adaptation. Because if Votkinsk and Cheboksary have already been reached, the Yamal Cross stops being just a piece of Russian energy infrastructure. It becomes an open question on Ukraine's range map. How much will Moscow have to spend to prove that its most sensitive points are still outside the war?